Picture this. You wake up in 1325. Your bed crawling with bugs. The smell of stale beer and sweat thick in the air. No morning coffee. No soft pajamas, just a wooden bucket for your business and pottage for breakfast. If you think modern life is tough, you've never experienced a day in the Middle Ages. Tonight, let's softly unravel why survival back then was anything but glamorous. Before we begin tonight's journey, I invite you to take a quiet moment, and if you're enjoying what you hear, feel free to gently tap the like button or subscribe, only if it feels right. I always love seeing where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. So, if you'd like, leave a little note in the comments. It's a peaceful thing, knowing we're all here together, from different corners of the world. Now, let's lower the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft, soothing hum, and ease into the calm as we begin tonight's story. Your morning in the 1300s began with a lungful of stale air, a mix of wet wool, animal musk, and last night's beer spills. No cozy blankets or soft pillows here. Just a straw mattress crawling with fleas so active they might as well have been your alarm clock. The bed was really just a sack of half-rotten hay tossed on a wooden platform. And if you were wealthy, maybe a wool blanket that hadn't been washed since harvest season. Forget rolling over for 5 more minutes when the church bell rang at dawn. You got up? No exceptions. Privacy wasn't a concept anyone wasted time thinking about. Your entire family slept in one room. Usually with the livestock, chickens might wander past your bed, pigs root in the corner, and the family cow sighing nearby. Walls were thin when they existed at all, so you heard every cough, snore, and argument from the neighbors. There was no getting ready in solitude. Everyone dressed, and relieved themselves in full view, personal space, more like personal myth. Speaking of relief, mornings started with the communal bucket in the corner. No porcelain throne. No flushing mechanism, just a wooden pail that everyone used until it was full enough to toss into the S. Treat if you were lucky. Someone remembered to empty it before it overflowed. There were no tissues, no scented soaps. A handful of straw or a dry leaf did the job, and honestly, you stopped noticing the smell after a while. At least until summer. The floor wasn't much better. Forget stepping onto warm carpet or smooth tiles. Your bare feet met packed dirt, possibly damp from rain seeping through the walls, or worse. No slippers waited by the bedside, just whatever grime had settled overnight. If you owned shoes at all, they were stiff leather things that rubbed your heels raw until they finally broke in sometime round midsummer. Let's talk about that straw mattress again, because it deserves its own horror story. The hay wasn't just itchy, it was a bug motel with unlimited vacancies. Fleas bounced round like they paid rent. Lice set up permanent residences, and if you woke with mysterious red bumps, congratulations, you'd probably hosted bedbugs. Straw poked through the thin fabric covering, leaving scratches that mixed with sweat and dirt to form a nice layer of grime. And no, you couldn't just buy a new one. This was your bed until it fully disintegrated. You'd think the cold would be the worst part, but medieval huts had a special talent for being both drafty and stuffy at the same time. The fire pit in the center smoked more than it warmed, so your eyes stung while your back stayed frozen. No pajamas, no thermal socks, just your same scratchy wool tunic you'd worn yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. Unless it was laundry day, which meant beating your clothes with a stick in the river and hoping the smell improved. Compare this to your modern morning, the quiet alarm. A mattress that doesn't bite back. A bathroom with a door that locks. You can brew coffee without worrying about the milk being sour. Because surprise refrigeration exists, you don't have to share your bedroom with chickens or argue over who forgot to empty the waste bucket, however bad your morning feels now. Medieval peasants would have traded places in a heartbeat. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse breakfast, a lukewarm bowl of pottage awaited. The same grey gruel you ate yesterday and would eat tomorrow. Maybe there were beans floating in it. Maybe a chunk of stale bread if the harvest was good. But the real treat, knowing this was the high point of your day before the sun burned off the dew and it was time to bend over a field until your back gave out. So that's your medieval wake-up ecology. Cold, and shared with every bug in the county. Morning routines back then weren't about easing into the day. They were about surviving long enough to face whatever fresh misery came next. Speaking of misery, let's talk about what passed for food in the 1300s. After surviving the flea circus that passed for a medieval bed, breakfast didn't offer much relief. You'd shuffle over to the fire pit, still rubbing sleep from your smoke-stung eyes, and find the same pot you saw last night still bubbling with yesterday's dinner. Now repurposed as breakfast, pottage wasn't so much a meal as it was a culinary hostage situation. The pot never emptied completely, just got topped up with whatever scraps were available. Grains, lentils, maybe a few sad carrots if it was a good year. The consistency ranged from lumpy porridge to something resembling wet plaster. Sometimes it contained sawdust as filler, because why not bulk up your gruel with wood shavings? It wasn't a recipe, just survival. The bread wasn't much better. Forget fluffy white loaves, this was dense. Dark stuff made from rye or barley, often bulked up with ground acorns when harvests were poor. It didn't slice, it crumbled. Or worse, required serious jaw effort to tear off a piece. The peasants called it horse bread for a reason. It was practically animal feed. There'd be no butter, of course, just a dry hunk of carbohydrates to chase your lukewarm gruel. The concept of fresh bread barely existed unless you baked daily. And most families didn't have that kind of time, so you gnawed on something that, by modern standards, would make a military ration taste gourmet. The drinks menu was just as bleak. You didn't get water, at least. Not if you valued your intestines. Medieval water was teeming with parasites and filth. So everyone, kids included, drank weak ale instead. It barely had any alcohol, just enough to kill some bacteria. But even that slight fermentation made it safer than straight water. It tasted like flat, grainy beer left out overnight. Breakfast of champions. More like breakfast of necessities. Coffee and tea wouldn't reach Europe for centuries. So, there was no morning caffeine boost, just a lukewarm mug of something that barely passed for hydration. Any modern person who complains about breakfast being boring should try medieval peasant. Diet for perspective. Your morning meal rotated between three variations: grey pottage, brown pottage, and slightly darker pottage. No eggs unless you found a chicken's nest before the Lord's tax collector did. No fruit unless you wanted to risk stealing from the church orchard. Meat appeared maybe twice a month, and even then, it was usually scrap stringy, tough, and so heavily salted it could preserve a body. Fresh milk spoiled to fast, so dairy meant hard cheese that tasted like regret, or butter stored in a questionable wooden crock. Nutrition wasn't just bad, it was inconsistent in winter. Pickled vegetables might be your only option for weeks in summer. Berries were a gamble to many raw ones, and you could end up hallucinating from mold toxins. The bread sometimes grew ergot, a fungus that caused convulsions and hallucinations, or, if you were very unlucky, gangrene. Peasants learned to ignore the occasional twitches and visions because, hey, food was food, and if a rat fell into the stew pot, protein, waste not. Want not especially when want meant starvation. Preservation methods were horrifying by modern standards. The meat, when they had any, wasn't refrigerated, just salted, smoked, or left hanging in a cellar to air dry. Flies landed on it freely. The fish, if you lived near water, often arrived already smelling questionable. No labels. No expiration dates. Just a communal hope that enough boiling would kill whatever was growing on it. Forget farm to table. This was more like field to fire to fingers crossed. Even basic seasonings were a luxury. Black pepper cost more than most people made in a month. So flavor came from whatever herbs grew wild. If you were lucky, a handful of onions could make the pottage taste vaguely like food instead of wet flour. Every meal was an exercise in risk management. One bad batch of grain, food poisoning. Mold on the bread, poisoning again. Spoiled meat, a slow, painful death. The line between dinner and dysentery was dangerously thin. Modern food safety laws exist because medieval dining was basically Russian roulette with a spoon. Breakfast didn't wake you up, it reminded you that every bite could be your last. Compare that to your current options. Cereal that stays crispy in milk, coffee brewed in minutes. Fruit shipped from across the world in winter. Even the dullest granola bar has more varied ingredients than a medieval peasant saw in a month. We complain about fast food, but at least drive-through meals won't give you ergot-induced visions. Pottage wouldn't even qualify as prison food today. It'd violate the Geneva Convention. The real kicker, this was the good part of the day. Breakfast meant you'd survive the night, which meant you got to look forward to another. Your medieval wardrobe wasn't about trends or comfort, it was about survival. You owned one outfit, maybe two if you were unusually fortunate. The staple was a rough wool tunic that scratched like burlap, worn every single day until it fell apart. No seasonal changes, no fancy fabrics. Just the same scratchy layer against your skin from harvest to planting and back again. Wool was the default because flax for linen was expensive and cotton wouldn't reach Europe for centuries. So you sweated in summer and froze in winter, with no breathable alternatives. The dye jobs were uneven at best, leaving your clothes a dull brown or grey, like you'd been rolled in dirt and left to dry. Underwear wasn't a given. If you were lucky, maybe a linen undertunic. If you weren't, well, you were going commando under layers of scratchy, sweaty wool. Women wore long shirts, but they were just as coarse. Neither offered real protection from the constant chafing. No elastic meant everything was tied with fraying cords that dug into your waist or sagged at. Inconvenient moments. Forget pockets, anything you needed to carry got tucked into your belt or balanced precariously in a pouch that was probably stolen by a goat at some point. Washing clothes was irrelevant. The idea of tossing something in a machine and having it come back clean would be bin. Witchcraft, instead. You hauled water from a freezing river, boiled it over a smoky fire, and scrubbed your tunic with ashes or stale urine. Then you prayed for one of those 3 sunny days a year to dry it. Even then, stains never really came out. Your clothes ended up stiff, faded, and scented like a compost pile left to marinate in a pigsty. That smell, that was your personal brand. Lice and fleas were just part of the package. Will was practically a luxury resort for pest swarm. Dense and rarely disturbed by soap. Everyone had them. Nobles, monks. Children, the whole village was basically a walking insect farm. The constant itching drove people. To carve personal scratching sticks out of wood, you'd be mid-conversation, digging at your armpit with a spoon and nobody blinked. Comb styles even included decorative lice removers because grooming meant plopping bugs from your hair into the nearest fire. Skin problems were unavoidable. Shaving turned into rashes. Sweat made everything worse. And if you develop something like scabies, well, too bad. No dermatologist, no hydrocortisone cream, just the uncomfortable certainty that your skin was angry and there was nothing to be done about it on feast days. You might see a neighbor's boil lanced with a dirty knife. And that was considered healthcare. Fashion wasn't just uncomfortable, it was hazardous. Stains told your life story in splotches. Mud from the fields, grease from the cooking pot, ill spilled while dodging your landlord, each mark was a badge of survival. But stains also marked your status. The cleaner your clothes, the less you worked. And peasants worked constantly. A noble might wear pristine fabrics to show they never lifted a finger. But your outfit screamed labor. Even if you could wash it, there wasn't time. Plowing, planting, hauling, every chore left its mark. Weather made everything worse. Rain soaked your wool, turning it into a heavy, reeking blanket that took days to dry. Winter frost stiffened the fabric until it could stand up. On its own, summer heat baked sweat into the fibers, attracting flies. There was no such thing as waterproof or breathable fabric, just varying degrees of damp misery. Footwear was a joke unless you were wealthy. Peasants wrapped their feet in cloth strips or wore crude leather shoes that curled at the toes. Like elf slippers, no arch support, no cushion soles. Just stiff hide that rubbed blisters until your feet toughened into leather themselves. Puddles leaked in, snow melted through, and by the end of the day, your socks, if you had any, were soaked with mud and worse. Compare this to modern life. You probably own more socks than a medieval village combined. Your washing machine handles a week's laundry in an hour. Synthetic fabrics wick sweat. Jackets block rain. And shoes come with memory foam. Even cheap modern clothes would have made a king jealous. The worst part, medieval people knew they were filthy. They just couldn't do much about it. Bathing required hulling and heating water. So full body washes happened maybe once a month. Churches even discouraged excessive bathing, claiming it opened pores to disease. Instead, you rubbed yourself with dry herbs if you were fancy, or just accepted that you'd always smell like a wet sheep. Clothing wasn't just fabric, it was a trap. Once you put it on, it stayed on until it rotted off you. There were no outfit changes for comfort. No fresh layers after a storm, just the same itchy, smelly, bug-infested wool, day after day, until it fell apart so completely you had to beg scraps from a neighbor. Even then, the replacement wouldn't be much better. But hey, at least fashion wasn't your biggest worry. Because next comes the real horror, medieval. Sanitation, where streets doubled as sewers and chamber pots were a spectator sport. Go into the bathroom in the 1300s was less a private moment and more a public health hazard waiting to happen. Forget porcelain thrones and locking doors, your toilet was often just a bucket in the corner of your one-room house, emptied whenever someone remembered to do it. In towns, people shouted Gardaloo before tossing waste into the street, a warning that mostly served to give pedestrians half a second to dodge. Streets weren't just roads, they were open sewers, layered with human filth, animal droppings, and mystery liquids that pooled between the cobblestones. Rain turned them into rivers of sludge. Summer baked them into a stench so thick you could taste it. Public latrines existed, but privacy wasn't part of the design. You'd sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers on a wooden bench with holes cut into it, your business on full display. Ventilation was an afterthought. So, the air hung heavy with the kind of smell that clung to your clothes for hours. Toilet paper wasn't an option. You wiped with whatever was handy: straw, leaves, moss, or if you were really desperate, a scrap of old wool. The concept of sanitation barely registered. These places weren't cleaned often, if at all, so by midday, The floors were slippery with things modern plumbing lets us flush away without a second thought. Even castles, those symbols of medieval luxury, had toilet situations that would make you cringe. Their garderobes were holes in the wall that dropped waist straight into the moat. This meant two things. First, the moat wasn't just water, it was a festering soup of human leavings. Second, these chutes sometimes became surprise entry points for attackers. Imagine storming a castle only to squeeze through a tunnel of centuries-old sewage. The smell alone could qualify as a weapon. The health risks were everywhere. Waste in the streets attracted rats, which carried fleas, which carried plague. Contaminated wells meant drinking water was a gamble. One sip could lead to dysentery, a disease that killed by dehydration so severe your body cramped itself to death. People knew waste was dirty, but they didn't fully grasp how diseases spread. They just accepted that life involved a constant low-level nausea and the occasional bout of violent illness. Bathing wasn't the solution. The church often discouraged it, claiming open pores let disease in. Some believed a layer of dirt protected you, like a second skin. Public bathhouses existed, but they were seen as scandalous places where people gossiped and misbehaved. Many were eventually shut down. For most, a full-body wash happened monthly, if that. You scrubbed with ashes or stale urine, then air dry in whatever weather was happening. No fluffy towels, no scented soaps, just the rough scrape of a linen rag, and the lingering sense that you might still smell like a goat. Dental hygiene didn't help the overall aroma. Rotten teeth were standard, breath permanently sour from a diet devoid of vitamins. Kissing wasn't just romantic, it was a health risk. The combination of bad breath, body odor, and untreated infections made close contact a sensory assault. People chewed herbs to mask the smell. But when everyone stank, you just learned to ignore it. The worst part, accidents happened all the time. A slip on a wet garderobe path could land you face first in waste. Chamber pots dipped over in the night, creating puddles you'd discover barefoot at dawn. Children played in streets where refuse piled, knee-high in places. Even nobles couldn't escape the filth their expensive robes dragged through. The same mark as everyone else as hems. Compare this to modern life. You flush without thinking. Your bathroom has a door, maybe even lock. Soap comes in liquid form, scented like lavender or ocean breeze. Toilet paper is soft and abundant. Sewers whisk waste away silently. Hospitals don't smell like death on a good day. The sheer convenience of it all would have made a medieval peasant weep with jealousy. Their world was one where privacy didn't exist. Sickness was constant, and every alley smelled like a latrine. We complain about public restrooms, but at least they have stores and hand sanitizer. The 1300s offered no such luxuries. Toileting wasn't just uncomfortable, it was humiliating, hazardous, and sometimes deadly. And if you think that sounds bad, wait until you hear about medieval medicine where the cure was often worse than the disease, and a simple headache could lead to a hole drilled in your skull. Your doctor's visit in the 1300s wasn't just unpleasant, it was borderline assault. Medieval medicine operated on humoral theory, a belief that for bodily fluids controlled health, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Keep them balanced. You stayed healthy. Imbalance meant sickness. This led to treatments that often made patients worse. Bloodletting was the go-to cure, administered by barbers doubling as surgeons. They'd slice open a vein with a dirty blade, draining what they deemed excess blood into a bowl. If you were lucky, you passed out from blood loss before feeling the full pain. If unlucky, you stayed conscious while your barber surgeon debated whether to take just a little more. Leeches were the slightly more civilized option. Dozens would be placed on your skin, their bites creating tiny wounds that bled freely. The theory was that they drew out bad humors. In reality, they just left you lightheaded and infected. Leeches weren't sterilized, just dunked in a pot between patients, transferring who knows what from person to person. The payoff for enduring this? Maybe feeling slightly less feverish, or possibly just passing out from blood loss. Either way, the leeches got fed, and your doctor got paid. Surgery wasn't any better. Anesthesia didn't exist, so operations happened while you were wide awake. A broken limb, they'd hold you down and saw. A battlefield wound, sewn up with unwashed thread. Surgeons believed pus was a sign of healing, so infections were practically expected. The lucky ones died quickly from shock. Others endured weeks of agony as wounds festered. Surgeons had no concept of germs, wiping instruments on their aprons between patients. A simple procedure could turn fatal when gangrene set in. Even minor injuries became life-threatening. A scratch from farming tools could lead to sepsis. A toothache might mean drilling into your jawbone to release evil spirits. Childbirth was a death. Lottery women routinely died from infections or hemorrhages. Dentists didn't exist. But barber surgeons did, yanking teeth with pliers while bystanders helped pin you down. Pain relief consisted of biting a leather strap or gulping wine. Neither worked well. Compare this to modern medicine. Antibiotics kill infections. Anesthesia makes surgery painless. Stitches use sterile thread, and recovery happens in clean hospital rooms. A medieval peasant would weep seeing how treatable today as emergencies are an infected cut cured by a week of pills, a cavity filled with numbing gel. Back then, a sprained ankle could mean lifelong lameness. Now it gets an ice pack and rest. Doctors weren't entirely ignorant, just working with terrible information. They prescribed herbs alongside prayers. Believing illness was both physical and spiritual. If you recovered, the doctor took credit. If you died, God's will. Their textbooks mixed genuine remedies, willow bark for pain with absurdities. How did unicorn horn? Diagnosis often involved inspecting urine's color and smell. Treatments ranged from helpful honey onwards to harmful mercury elixirs. Dental care barely existed. People chewed herbs to freshen breath. But rotted teeth were universal. Tooth extraction was brutal, no numbing agents. Just crude pliers and a strong assistant to hold your head still. The rich might afford a scented. Clove to bite down on. The poor got a stick. Oral infections routinely killed. Abscesses spreading to the brain with no antibiotics to stop them. Women's health care was worse. Childbirth was lethal without modern techniques or sanitation. Midwives helped. But complications meant death. Postpartum infections killed thousands, if periods were painful. Remedies included sitting over steam or drinking questionable tonics. Medicine viewed women as unstable due to their shifting humors, leading to treatments like bleeding them to calm hysterics. Mental illness received no compassion. Those exhibiting strange behavior were often deemed possessed, treated with exorcisms or confinement. Autistic or epileptic individuals faced abuse and isolation. Depression was seen as laziness, treated with prayer or punishment. The idea of therapy would have baffled medieval minds. Contagious diseases spread unchecked. Without germ theory, nobody understood infection. Plagues wiped out whole towns while doctors bled patients, accelerating deaths. Quarantines existed but were poorly enforced. The sick often died alone. Their belongings burned, one of the few effective practices, though they didn't know why. Pharmacies were nothing like today's. Apothecaries sold moldy herbs, tinctures of questionable origin, and pills containing everything from opium to ground-up mummies. Dosages were guesses. Too little did nothing. too much could kill. Well did patients risk poisoning from cures loaded with heavy metals. The poor made do with folk remedies, hoping nature would sort it out. Infant mortality was high. 1 in 5 children died before age 5. Those surviving faced a lifetime of illness rickets from poor nutrition, tuberculosis from damp homes, parasites from unclean water. Parents expected to bury some of their children. A grief so common it shaped entire cultures. Medical education was patchy. Universities are trained. Physicians. But most people saw barber surgeons or village healers. Training involved apprenticeships, learning by doing, not studying. Mistakes were frequent. Corpses plentiful. Surgeons boasted about speed, not accuracy. The fastest amputation record was under a minute. A grim badge of honor. Recovery was pure chance, without imaging or proper diagnostics. Doctors guessed at internal problems. His stomachache might be treated with laxatives even if the real issue was an ulcer. Fevers were bled, worsening dehydration. Survivors weren't healed so much as temporarily not dead. Skepticism existed but was dangerous. Questioning humoral theory risked accusations of heresy. Innovators were ignored or punished. Progress stalled for centuries, trapped by dogma and fear. Meanwhile, patients suffered through treatments that often hastened their demise. The rich fared slightly better not because medicine was superior, but because they could afford rest and cleaner living conditions. Even kings died from trivial infections, though. No amount of money could buy effective health care until modern science arrived. Medieval medicine wasn't just primitive, it was ritualized torture with occasional accidental benefits. Patients endured agony based on theories we now know are false. Doctors genuinely tried to help, but their tools were ignorance and superstition. Every cure was a dice roll between relief and accelerated death. Surviving the Middle Ages wasn't just about avoiding injury, it was about dodging the healers too. Next comes another daily horror. Back-breaking labor without rest or rights. The medieval workday began before sunrise and ended long after dark, 6 days a week. You rose with the sun and stopped only when it disappeared behind the trees. No weekends, no holidays, just endless labor with a wooden hoe in your blistered hands and a rusty sickle at your belt. The fields didn't care if you were tired. The crops didn't wait because your back ached. Every day was a battle against the soil, fought with whatever bones were still intact in your body. Plowing was back-breaking work. The oxen moved slowly, and the heavy wooden plow required constant force to keep it straight. Your shoulders burned from the strain. Your feet slipped in the mud, and the sun beat down until your tunic stuck to your skin. There were no ergonomic tools, no cushioned grips, just raw human effort against unyielding earth. Sowing seed meant walking bent double for hours. Scattering grain by hand while birds swooped down to steal it. Weeding was done on your knees. Fingernails packed with dirt, spine curled like a question mark. Women didn't just do field work. After hauling water and harvesting crops, they returned home to care for children, clean, cook, spin wool, and feed animals. There was no division between work and home life, just an unbroken chain of labor from dawn until collapsing into a flea-ridden bed. No one asked how your mental health was doing. No one cared if your hands were raw or your feet swollen. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. If you got sick, someone else took your place. Children started helping out around age 5. They scared birds from the fields, gathered firewood, or minded younger siblings. There was no school, no playtime, just tiny hands learning to grind grain or cart wool. By 10, they worked alongside adults. By 15, their bodies were already worn down from years of strain. A break meant sitting long enough to chew a crust of bread before someone yelled at you to get back to work. If you weren't a farmer, your job was just as brutal. Blacksmiths breathed in charcoal fumes in sweltering sheds. Their arms scarred from burns. Tanners soaked hides in urine-filled pits, the stench clinging to them for life. Coopers bent over woodland barrels until their spines began to resemble the letter S. The pay was basically survival enough to keep you alive so you could work again tomorrow. The only perks were the occasional injury or lung disease from breathing sawdust all day. There were no workers' rights, no minimum wage, no safety regulations. If a tool broke and sliced your leg open, you wrapped it in a dirty rag and kept going. If the Lord demanded extra labor during harvest, you gave it or faced punishment. The idea of quitting didn't exist. You were born into your role and died in it, with no clocking out. Sundays were for church, but even then, you might be ordered to harvest or repair fences if the weather was right. The tools were primitive and inefficient. Sickles required swinging over until your arm went numb. Flails threshed grain by hand, sending chaff into your eyes and lungs. Water had to be carried in heavy buckets from wells or streams, one back-breaking trip after another. Every task took 10 times longer than it would today, with 10 times the effort. A modern tractor does in an hour what took medieval peasants weeks of dawn to dusk labor. Hunger was a constant motivator. You worked because if you didn't, your family starved. There were no sick days, no unemployment benefits. A bad harvest meant choosing which family member got the smallest portion. A broken bone could mean begging by the roadside. The threat of hunger kept you moving even when every muscle screamed to stop. Nobility didn't lift a finger, but they took a third of everything you grew. Tithes for the church came next. What remained had to last through winter. You ate the same gruel every day, while the Lord's table groaned with meat and wine. If you did complain, the bailiff would remind you whose land you lived on. Resistance meant eviction or worse. Compare this to modern work. You have weekends, lunch breaks, OSHA regulations. If you're injured, there's workers' comp. If you're overworked, you can quit and find another job. Medieval peasants had none of that. Their lives were an unbroken cycle of labor, with rest only coming in death. The work didn't just break bodies, it broke spirits. Generations lived and died in the same fields, their names forgotten, their lives reduced to how much grain they produced. There was no upward mobility, no dream of something better, just sunrise to sunset, season after season. Until you were too old to lift a hoe and your children took your place. Yet they persevered. They woke each morning and faced the fields again. They found moments of laughter during harvest festivals, fleeting joy in rare feasts. Their resilience built the foundations of the modern world, one back-breaking day at a time. But hard work didn't guarantee respect. Next comes the rigid social hierarchy that kept peasants in their place, where your birth determined your worth as surely as the soil determined your crops. In medieval society, the moment you were born decided everything about your future. There were no job fairs, no college applications, just the unchangeable fact of which family you came from. If your parents were peasants, you'd be a peasant. If they were nobles, you'd live in a castle. The system was called feudalism, and it worked like a ladder with the rungs cemented in place. At the top sat the king, who owned all the land. Below him were lords and knights, then priests and monks, and at the very bottom, the peasants who worked the fields. This wasn't just a class system, it was a life sentence. Peasants made up about 90% of the population, but they had less power than a noble's hunting dog. They were tied to the land, legally bound to work for whatever lord controlled their village. You couldn't move away, couldn't change jobs, couldn't even get married without your lord's permission. Every year, you handed over a chunk of your harvest as rent. If you were a serf, the lowest peasant class you also worked the lord's fields for free several days a week. Your entire existence revolved round feeding people above you who'd never lift a finger to help. The idea of moving up in the world would have made them laugh. The best you could hope for was not starving before winter ended. Nobles had it better, but not as much as you'd think. Sure, they lived in stone manors instead of mud huts, but their lives were full of their own problems. Lords constantly worried about keeping the king's favor, defending their land from rivals, or funding expensive wars. A noble woman might sleep on a feather mattress, but she'd also be married off at 12 to some grizzled knight twice her age for a political gain. Even their fancy clothes came with headaches. Imagine wearing layers of wool and linen in summer because showing skin was improper. Their kids weren't free either. Noble sons got shipped off to other castles as pages at age 7, while daughters became bargaining chips for alliances. The church was the only semi-mobile rung on the ladder. A clever peasant boy might become a priest, if he memorized enough Latin, but for most, the clergy was just another form of servitude. Monks woke at 2 a.m. for prayers, copied books by candlelight until their eyesight failed, and ate bland meals in silence. Nuns spent their lives locked away, weaving tapestries for wealthy donors. The higher church officers, bishops, cardinals went to nobles' younger sons. Not talented commoners. Even holiness had a class system. Class distinctions affected everything, down to the way people walked. Peasants shuffled with the hunched posture of field workers. Nobles strutted in expensive shoes that kept their feet clean. The Lord treated them differently, too. A noble who killed a peasant might pay a fine. A peasant who stole a noble's bread lost a hand. If you were born poor, the law wasn't there to protect you, it existed to keep you in your place. Even clothing laws enforced hierarchy. Sumptuary laws dictated what fabrics each class could wear. A merchant's wife couldn't dress like a duchess, no matter how rich she got. The rules made sure everyone stayed visually in their lane. Modern society isn't perfect, but at least you have options. Today, someone born in a trailer park can become a doctor. A factory worker's kid might start a tech company. Medieval peasants didn't have that hope. Education was forbidden to most. Apprenticeships went to those with connections. The rare peasant who somehow got rich faced resentment. Towns passed laws to block new money. Families from joining guilds or holding office. Upward mobility wasn't just difficult. It was actively suppressed. The nobility suffered too, in their own way. Wars constantly threatened their lands. A bad harvest meant starving tenants couldn't pay rent. Plagues wiped out their workforce. Many nobles were deeply in debt from maintaining their status, throwing feasts, buying armor, funding crusades. Some mortgaged their estates to moneylenders and spent years trying to pay it back. Their privilege came with constant pressure to prove they deserved it. Women had it worst across all classes. Noble women were traded like property in marriage deals. Peasant women worked fields while pregnant, then returned to work days after giving birth. Townswomen ran shops, but couldn't join most guilds. A widow might inherit her husband's business, but men would constantly challenge her right to it, no matter how highborn. Women couldn't rule in their own right unless they were queens, and even then, everyone preferred a king. The system's rigidity created bizarre contradictions. A skilled peasant baker might make bread fit for a king, but he'd still sleep in a hovel. A noble who lost a war could end up chained in a dungeon, his fine clothes crawling with lice. The Pope lived in luxury while parish priests starved on tithes. Yet no one questioned the arrangement. It was simply how the world worked, as unchangeable as the seasons. Compare this to today's world. Flawed as it is, you can vote for your leaders, choose your job, marry who you love. You might not become a billionaire, but you can rise above your parents' station. Medieval people didn't have that hope. Their lives were predetermined before they took their first breath. The system wasn't designed for fairness, it was built for control. But control only works if people fear the consequences of breaking rules. Which brings us to medieval justice, where punishment was a public spectacle designed to remind everyone who held the power. Justice in the Middle Ages wasn't about fairness, it was about sending a message. If you stole a loaf of bread, they didn't give you a fine. They cut off your hand if you were accused of lying. They might drive a hot iron through your tongue. The punishments weren't just about the crime. They were about making sure everyone else got the point. The law didn't care about rehabilitation. It cared about making examples. Public humiliation was a favorite tactic. Gossips got the scold's bridle. A metal cage strapped to the head with a spiked plate that pressed down on the tongue. Wear it long enough, and you'd stop talking permanently. Cheats got locked in stocks in the town square, where kids threw rotten food at them. Petty thieves had their ears nailed to a post and were given a knife to cut themselves free. The message was clear: step out of line, and your suffering would be everyone's entertainment. Serious accusations, witchcraft, heresy, treason meant trial by ordeal. You'd stick your hand in boiling water to pull out a stone. If the wound festered, you were guilty. If it healed, God had spared you. Or they'd throw you in a river tied up if you sank. You were innocent. If you floated, the water had rejected you, and they'd drag you out to burn you. The system wasn't designed to find truth. It was designed to make people too scared to even look suspicious. Executions were public events, like festivals but with more screaming. Hangings drew crowds. Beheadings were reserved for nobles cleaner, quicker. Burnings were for heretics and witches, the smoke carrying the smell of charred flesh over the town. People brought snacks. Kids played games while someone choked to death on the gallows. The condemned weren't people, they were lessons. Domestic violence wasn't just allowed. It was encouraged. A man could beat his wife as long as he used a stick no thicker than his thumb. Children got whipped for minor misbehavior. Servants had no rights at all if a master killed one. He might pay a small fine. The laws didn't protect the weak. They rewarded the strong. Straight justice was just as brutal. If you caught a thief, you could beat him on the spot. If someone insulted your honor, you settled it with fists or knives. Duels happened over spilled ale or bad jokes. There were no police to call. Just neighbors who might help or might watch you bleed out if they didn't like you. Nobles escaped the worst punishments. A lord who killed a peasant might pay a fine. A peasant who stole from a lord lost fingers or his life. Status mattered more than guilt. Rich men bought pardons. Poor men swung from ropes. The system wasn't blind. It knew exactly who it favored. Women had it worse. A wife couldn't accuse her husband of abuse. He had the legal right to correct her. Women, accused of witchcraft, weren't allowed defenders. Prostitutes were whipped while their customers walked free. Even noble women had no real legal power. Their husbands or fathers spoke for them in court. The church ran its own courts, separate from the king's. Clergy who committed crimes got softer punishments, no bloodshed. Just penance. Blasphemy got your tongue cut out. Heresy got you burned. The message: God's laws were harsher than the king's. Prisons existed, but not like today. You didn't get a cell with a bed. You got a dungeon dark, wet, crawling with rats. No meals unless family brought them. No trial unless someone cared enough to demand one. You could rot for years waiting for a judge who'd forgotten you existed. Torture was routine. If you were accused, You were probably guilty, they just needed you to say it. Waterboarding, the rack, thumbscrews all tools to hurry a confession along. The truth didn't matter. Getting the right answer did. The legal system wasn't about justice. It was about control. Keep people terrified, and they'll obey. Make punishment ugly enough. And no one risks rebellion. The laws didn't exist to protect. They existed to remind everyone who had power and who didn't. Compare this to modern justice. Today, you get a lawyer. You get a trial. You get rights. Back then, your trial might be a coin toss. Your lawyer might be the guy accusing you. The only right you had was the right to suffer. But the law was just one way the church kept control. Next comes religion, where fear didn't just enforce order in this life, but promised eternal punishment in the next. The church bell didn't just mark time, it owned it. Your entire schedule revolved round prayer cycles, matins at dawn, vespers at dusk, and everything in between. Miss a service, and you weren't just lazy. You were sinful. The church controlled when you worked, when you rested, even when you could eat meat. Feast days, fast days, saints' days, your calendar wasn't yours. It belonged to the clergy. Tithes weren't optional. 1/10 of everything you produced went to the church. Wheat, eggs, wool, they took it all. If you grew nothing, you paid in labor. Refusing meant excommunication, which was worse than death. An excommunicated person couldn't attend Mass, receive sacraments, or be buried on consecrated ground. Their soul was doomed. Their family was shunned. The church didn't just want your money. It needed your fear. Hell wasn't some abstract idea. Priests described it in vivid detail. Rivers of fire, demons with hooks, souls screaming in eternal agony. These sermons weren't about comfort. They were about control. A peasant might not understand Latin, but they understood the priest's description of sinners roasting on spits. The message was clear: obey, or burn forever. The Bible might as well have been written in code. It existed only in Latin, a language peasants didn't speak. This wasn't an accident. If people couldn't read scripture, they couldn't question the church's interpretation. The clergy decided what God wanted, and no one else got a say. A peasant hearing Mass didn't hear the word of God. They heard the word of priests, filtered through a language they'd never learn. Compare this to modern religion. You can choose your faith, read holy texts in your own language, or skip church entirely. In the 1300s, that wasn't an option. The church was the law, the school, and the moral compass all in one. Questioning it wasn't just rebellion, it was heresy. Punishable by burning. Women faced extra restrictions. The church taught that if sin made all. Women weak and dangerous. A wife couldn't refuse her husband. A daughter couldn't choose her path. Even noble women would trap their piety measured by how quietly they obeyed. The only respectable female rules were wife. Nun, or widow. Anything else risked accusations of witchcraft. Marriages weren't about love. They were business deals blessed by priests. Two families would trade land or livestock, then have the church seal the union. Consent was optional. A 12-year-old girl could be married off to a 40-year-old man, and the church would call it God's will. Divorce didn't exist. If your husband beat you, the church said you probably deserved it. The church controlled death, too. Without last rites, your soul might linger in purgatory for centuries. Families paid priests to pray for the dead, buying their way into heaven coin by coin. A rich man's soul could skip the line. A poor man's might never escape, even in death. The church found ways to profit. Crop failures weren't bad luck. They were divine punishment. If your fields flooded, The priest said you hadn't prayed enough. If your child died, you must have sinned. There was no randomness in medieval thinking. Everything plagues, droughts. Stillbirths was a message from God. Decoded by the clergy, education belonged to the church. The few schools that existed trained. Priests, not peasants. If you learned to read, it was to chant Latin verses you didn't understand. Knowledge was dangerous in the wrong hands. A peasant who asked too many questions might find himself accused of heresy. The church's power wasn't just spiritual. It owned vast lands, collected taxes, and even raised armies. Bishops lived like kings while parish priests starved. The Pope could depose emperors with a word. When the church said jump, rulers asked how high. This wasn't religion. It was an empire built on fear. Modern faith offers choices. You can switch denominations, read different translations, or reject religion entirely. In the Middle Ages, the church was the only game in town. There was no freedom of conscience, no separation of church and state, just one unchallenged authority ruling every aspect of life. But the church's control wasn't absolute. People still found ways to resist. They told jokes about greedy priests. They hid pagan traditions under Christian names. They whispered in fields where no clergy could. Here, the system was brutal, but humans have always found cracks in the walls. Yet, for most, resistance was too risky. It was easier to kneel, pray, and hand over that 10th bushel of wheat. The church didn't just promise salvation. It threatened eternal torment. When your choices are obey or burn, compliance isn't faith. It's survival. And survival was hardest for one group above all, women. While men grumbled about tithes, women faced a system designed to break them. Their bodies, their choices, even their souls were controlled by men both in the church and outside it. The church controlled your calendar, your laws, your education if you could read, your birth, marriage, death, and everything in between. You went through the motions. You chanted, you bowed, you prayed that your soul, after enduring this dirt-covered life, might finally land in paradise, assuming the priest liked you. But paradise wasn't the only thing at stake. The church also dictated what happened on earth, especially when it came to women's lives. While men could at least pretend to have some autonomy, women were trapped from cradle to grave by rules written entirely by men. If you think medieval religion was about spirituality, think again. It was about power absolute, unchallenged, and enforced with fire and brimstone. The church didn't guide souls. It owned them and will betide. Anyone who dared to question the deal. Yet, even under this weight, people found ways to live, love, and occasionally laugh at their oppressors. The human spirit is stubborn that way, but for women. That spirit faced its greatest test not just from the church, but from every aspect of medieval society. From the moment you were born female in the Middle Ages, your path was set. You marry young, bear children, obey your husband, and work until your body gave out. There were no choices, no alternatives, just a lifetime of labor and silent suffering. If you thought being a medieval peasant was rough, try doing it as a woman. All the filth, famine, and fear, plus childbirth, subservience, and social invisibility. Marriage happened early, really early. Most girls were betrothed by 12, mothers by 14. It wasn't about love. It was about land, livestock, and alliances. Your opinion wasn't required. Fathers haggled over dowries while you stood there like another piece of property being traded. The groom might be twice your age, missing teeth, with breath like spoiled meat. Didn't matter. Your job was to say I do. Then start producing heirs immediately. Once married, you were basically your husband's property. The law gave him absolute control over your body, your labor, your freedom. He could beat you as long as his stick was no thicker than his thumb. Refusing him in bed was grounds for divorce, except divorce wasn't for you. It meant he could cast you aside, leaving you destitute. Your only real value was your womb. Failed to get pregnant, and everyone blamed you. Your mother-in-law would glare, neighbors would whisper about curses, and your husband might start eyeing younger brides. Childbirth was a death lottery. No pain relief beyond a sip of ale. No midwives with sterile tools, just village women using hands caked with dirt from their last. Delivery. About 1 in 5 mothers died in childbirth. Infection. Hemorrhage. Exhaustion, take your pick. If the baby got stuck, someone might reach in with unwashed fingers to pull it out by force. Survive the birth, and you'd be back working in the fields within days. There were no maternity leaves, no recovery time. The baby either lived or didn't. Either way, you kept working. Education wasn't an option unless you were nobility, and even then, only enough to read prayers, not challenge ideas. Most women couldn't even sign their names. Knowledge was dangerous in female hands. A woman who spoke too boldly, who knew herbs and healing, or worst of all, dared to disagree with men. That woman might find herself accused of witchcraft. Women who didn't conform were often accused of witchcraft. Knowing too much about medicine, witchcraft. Having an opinion, witchcraft. Miscarrying a baby, definitely witchcraft. The punishments ranged from humiliating, like the scold's bridle that silenced nagging wives, too deadly. Some villages tested witches by tossing them in ponds. Float, and you're guilty. So they burn you, sick, and you're innocent, but also drown. Either way. The system was rigged, even in the church. Your role was limited. Nuns lived under brutal rules, silent labor, strict fasts, and absolute obedience. They might teach noble girls to embroider or copy manuscripts, but real scholarship was for men. A nun caught reading philosophy might be whipped. Your soul mattered, but never as much as a man's. Original sin started with Eve. Remember, every sermon reminded you that women caused humanity's fall. Daily life was relentless, while men plowed fields or crafted goods. Your work never ended. Brew ale, spin wool, milk cows, cook meals, tend children, clean clothes with foul-smelling lie and repeat until you collapsed. There were no women's rights to rest, no laws against overwork. Your hands cracked and bled from scrubbing, your back ached from carrying water, your lungs burned from fireplace smoke, and you did it all while pregnant, nursing, or breathing dead infants. Your body wasn't yours. It was your husband's bed, the village's labor source, the church's moral battleground. Men wrote textbooks claiming women enjoyed rape. Doctors said female pleasure caused birth defects if you sought any control over pregnancy. That was witchcraft too. Periods were shameful secrets. Menopause a sign of decay. Every bodily function was someone else's business to regulate. Surviving childhood was hard enough. As a girl, you'd work alongside your brothers until marriage, but with extra chores, weaving, childcare, food preparation. Then came the risks of early pregnancy on an undeveloped body. Survive that, and you faced decades of labor. If you made it to 40, you were practically a celebrity. Most women didn't. The few who outlived their husbands might gain slight freedom as widows. Some ran businesses or managed property. But even then, you needed male relatives to vouch for you. A widow with no sons was vulnerable, her land coveted. her safety uncertain. Many ended up in convents not by choice, but because nowhere else would take them. Contrast this with modern life. Today, you can vote, own property, choose your spouse, attend university. You can divorce an abusive partner, control your fertility, report assault. None of that existed then. A medieval woman had more in common with livestock than with modern women. The system crushed creativity, ambition, even basic joy. No female poets were celebrated unless they wrote about God. No female artists signed their work. Brilliant minds wasted fetching water and mending socks. Historians rarely wrote about peasant women unless they died unusually burned as witches or dying in childbirth. Your entire existence was meant to be invisible service. Some resisted quietly. Midwives passed down herbal knowledge despite church disapproval. Wives hid bruises with scarves and kept working. Mothers taught daughters secret comfort songs, stories, small acts of defiance. But real change was impossible. The entire world was built to keep you obedient, afraid, and above all, silent. In the Middle Ages, being a woman was like being on hard mode with no health potions and no restart button. Every day was a gauntlet of dangers men never faced. Your body wasn't yours. Your time wasn't yours. Even your soul wasn't yours. It was just another thing men claimed authority over. Yet they needed you. Without women's labor, the whole system collapsed. Without your womb, lines of inheritance vanished. The irony: the very people treated as property held society together with their calloused hands. Modern women inherit freedoms those medieval women couldn't imagine. But remember, those rights were clawed from a world that fought viciously against them. Every vote, every paycheck, every choice you have today was denied to your ancestors. Their suffering built foundations they never got to stand on. Living past 40 was rare. Surviving childbirth was lucky. But the real miracle: any joy at all under that weight. Somewhere, a woman laughed with her sister while washing clothes. Somewhere, a grandmother sang to a grandchild. The system tried to crush them, but humanity flickered anyway. That's the real rebellion. Now consider reaching 40 at all an achievement, so rare it earned nicknames. In a world where danger lurked everywhere, simply lasting decades was a victory. But getting there meant surviving medieval medicine next. Reaching 40 in the Middle Ages wasn't just impressive, it was practically a miracle. The average life expectancy hovered between 30 and 40 years, but that number hides the brutal reality. Half of all children died before turning 5. If you made it past childhood, you are already considered lucky. By 25, your body was breaking down, joints aching, teeth rotting, back bent from years of labor. The idea of retirement didn't exist. You worked until you dropped, and dropping usually happened sooner rather than later. Infant mortality was so common that parents didn't name babies until they survived a few months. A crib might hold 3 siblings over the years, each one replacing the last. Diseases like smallpox and measles swept through villages, taking the weakest first. Malnutrition made things worse. If harvests failed, children's bellies swelled from hunger while parents gave their own portions to keep them alive a little longer. Surviving childhood wasn't just about avoiding illness, it was about dodging accidents, animal attacks, and the occasional drowning in a shallow creek. Adulthood wasn't much safer. A simple cut from farming tools could turn septic. A winter chill became pneumonia. Women faced the added danger of childbirth. 1 in 5 didn't survive it. Even if you avoided these risks, your body wore out fast. By 35, you looked 50 by modern standards, skin leathery from sun, hands gnarled from work, spine permanently hunched. The idea of middle age didn't exist. You were either young or old. And old came quick. Death lurked everywhere. Plague could wipe out your village in weeks. Famine turned strong men into walking skeletons. Bandits prowled roads. Tax collectors took your last grain. And even a trip to the market might end with a broken neck from a slippery path. Wars dragged men away to die in foreign fields. Women starved when their husbands didn't return. Life was so fragile that people wrote wills as soon as they married, knowing they might not see next harvest. Funerals were quick and simple. No embalming. No fancy coffins, just a shroud and a shallow grave. Churches ran out of space fast, so bones were often dug up after a few years to make room. Mourning was brief because work couldn't wait. A widow might remarry within months, not for love, but because surviving alone was impossible. Grieving was a luxury few could afford. Compare this to modern life. Today, you expect to live past 70. Vaccines protect kids from diseases that wiped out medieval families. Hospitals fix broken bones before they turn deadly. Retirement means rest. Not working until you collapse. Even poverty today looks nothing like medieval starvation. Your worst day now would have been a good day back then. The constant threat of death shaped everything. People married young because they might not see 25. They had kids quickly because half wouldn't survive. They hoarded food not out of greed, but fear of winter. Every decision was made with the clock ticking. The church promised heaven because earth was so short and cruel. Yet somehow, people found moments of joy. A baby's first steps, a harvest feast, a rare hour of rest in the sun. These small victories mattered more when life was short. A single good apple tasted sweeter when you knew hunger was coming. A warm day in winter felt like a gift, the irony. Many medieval people lived harder by 20 than most of us will in a lifetime. Their bodies aged faster, their struggles were constant, and their safety nets were non-existent. Reaching 40 wasn't just luck, it was endurance. Surviving childhood, childbirth, plagues, and back-breaking work required stubbornness we can barely imagine. Modern medicine gives us decades they never had. We worry about cholesterol while they worried about the next meal. We retire at 65. They were lucky to see 45. Our biggest health risks are self-inflicted too much food, too little exercise. Theirs were forces beyond control. Weather, disease, the Lord's demands. Even nobles died young. Kings fell in battles, their armor no match for infection. Ladies died in childbirth just like peasants. The playing field was level when it came to life expectancy. Money bought better food and shelter, but not antibiotics or vaccines. A noble's life might be more comfortable, but it wasn't necessarily longer. The shortness of life made people pragmatic. There was no time for midlife crises or existential dread. You married, worked, had kids, and hoped they outlived you. Philosophy was for monks peasants were too busy surviving to ponder meaning. Yet they left marks. The churches they built, the fields they plowed, the children they raised against all odds. Their lives were short but not small. Every loaf of bread baked, every stitch sewn, every baby kept alive through winter was a victory. We judge them by our standards. Why didn't they invent this? Protest that. But they were too busy not dying. Progress requires leisure, safety, full bellies. They had none of those. Their greatest achievement was enduring. Now imagine living with that constant uncertainty. No doctors, no insurance, no safety nets, just day after day of work. With death always one bad harvest or fever away. The stress alone would kill a modern person. Yet they woke each morning and did it again. Their lives weren't just shorter, they were harder in ways we can't fathom. A bad day now is traffic or a slow Wi-Fi connection. A bad day then was your child coughing blood or your husband not coming home from the fields. Perspective changes when death isn't abstract but a daily visitor. Yet they found light, music at festivals, stories by firelight, the occasional stolen kiss. Joy wasn't less meaningful because life was short, it was more precious. They knew what we often forget, that survival isn't guaranteed. And every day above ground is a win. We've traded that urgency for longevity. Our lives are long, but sometimes feel small, clogged with distractions they'd find absurd. They'd pity our existential boredom, just as we pity their suffering. Maybe both perspectives have value, but let's not romanticize it. Their lives weren't noble or simple, they were brutal and short. The fact that they carried on, anyway, is the real miracle, not the castles or cathedrals, but the stubborn will to keep going when every odds said stop. And in those rare moments between survival, they laughed, loved, and lived briefly, fiercely, with no guarantees. That's the real story, not how they died, but how they squeezed life from a world that gave them so little of it. Now imagine finding joy in that world. Not the grand, Hollywood-style revelry, but the quiet moments of relief. A shared drink after harvest. A song in the fields. The medieval equivalent of leisure wasn't vacations, it was catching your breath before the next storm. After a year of back-breaking labor, medieval peasants got about 8 official holidays if the harvest was good and their lord approved. These rare breaks were everything. Imagine working 6 brutal days a week, every muscle aching. Then finally getting one day to drink weak ale and watch someone juggle pig bladders. That was paradise. Festivals revolved round the church calendar, but they weren't solemn affairs. May Day saw villagers dancing round flower-decked poles. 12 night meant electing a lord of misrule to turn social order upside down. Midsummer brought bonfires where couples disappeared into the woods. For a few hours, the rigid rules relaxed. A peasant could mock his lord through puppet shows. A woman might lead the dancing without criticism. The ale flowed, the music played, and just for once, no one worried about tomorrow's work. Music was everywhere, not because people had free time, but because they made time. Field workers sang to pace their labor. Women chanted while spinning wool. Minstrels traveled. Between towns, trading songs from mills, instruments were simple drums made from stretched goat skin. Flutes carved from reeds. No sheet music, no concert halls, just voices rising together after dark. A good singer might get an extra bowl of pottage. A terrible one got laughed at, but kindly. In a world without recordings, live music was priceless. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment, it was survival. On long winter nights, families gathered round the fire while elders recounted tales. Some were ancient epics about dragons and warriors. Others were local gossip dressed up as fables. Children learned which mushrooms to avoid through stories about fools who ate them. History passed orally, with each teller adding flourishes. The line between fact and fiction blurred. But the lesson stuck. A clever peasant might tweak a story to mock the Lord without getting. Wept, humor became resistance. Jokes from the air reveal what they found funny. Drunken priests, cheating wives, pompous nobles falling into dung heaps. The humor was dark, raw, and surprisingly familiar. One surviving medieval joke. A man begs death to take him. Death says, I would. But my quota for this village is full. They laughed in the face of misery because crime didn't. Help, games provided rare moments of childhood. Kids played with sticks and stones, pretending they were swords and jewels. Adults gambled with dice carved from bone even when the church forbade it. Chess spread slowly, a luxury for those who could afford the pieces. Most sports were chaotic brawls masquerading as competitions. Football matches involved entire villages chasing a ball across miles, breaking bones and fences with equal enthusiasm. Dancing was one of the few acceptable ways to touch another person. Courtly dances had strict rules, but peasant dances were wild and sweaty. Circles formed round fires, feet stomping to drums. Couples flirted through choreography. For people who worked until their hands bled, moving without purpose was revolutionary. The limited leisure made every second precious. Unlike today, where you can binge Netflix for hours, medieval fun happened in stolen moments, a song while mending nets, a joke whispered during mass. Workers snuck dice games into barns. Lovers met in fields after dark. Joy wasn't scheduled, it was seized. Contrast this with modern entertainment. You can watch any movie instantly, chat with friends worldwide, or lose days scrolling. Medieval people had maybe 10 truly festive days a year. The rest was work with snippets of relief, a shared apple, a funny story, a warm spot by the fire. Yet those snippets kept them going. Our idea of medieval fun is warped by movies, jousting tournaments, lavish feasts, harpists in gowns. Reality was messier. Tournaments were for nobles. Peasants just watched. Feasts meant extra bread, not roasted swans. Most entertainment was homemade, a neighbor's bad. Singing, kids acting out Bible stories. Someone's drunk uncle falling over. The glamour was absent. The joy was real. Hardship shaped their pleasures. After surviving plague, famine, and a landlord's whims, simple things meant more. A sunny afternoon felt like a gift when you spent winter shivering. A full belly was heaven after months of gruel. Modern comforts have dulled our appreciation for. Basics they celebrated wildly. The church tried to control fun, banning dice games and rowdy theater. It never worked. People hid dice in their shoes. They performed banned plays in barns. Even piety became playful mocking sermons, irreverent carvings in church pews. Wherever there were rules, someone found a way to laugh round them. These small rebellions kept spirits alive. A woman might sneak berries into the tithe basket, keeping the sweetest for her kids. A plowman could pretend not to see rabbits stealing his lord's vegetables. Survival wasn't just physical, it was about preserving your humanity in a system designed to crush it. Modern people romanticize medieval festivals as quaint and colorful. The truth was grittier. Dancing happened in muddy fields. Ale was sour. Music competed with animal noises. But for people who spent most lives in silent toil, the noise was glorious. What's remarkable isn't that they partied hard, but that they partied at all. Between back pain, hunger, and constant danger, finding energy to sing took effort. Doing it together, that was resistance. Every laugh, every song, was a middle finger to the darkness. Today, leisure is a given. Back then, it was a victory. Peasants didn't relax because their work was done. They snatched joy because it might not come again. That urgency made their pleasures sharper than ours. A modern concert can compete with the thrill of a traveling minstrel when it is your only music in a year. Yet our medieval ancestors would envy our boredom. They'd marvel at a world where I am bored means you've exhausted YouTube. Not that you've heard every story your grandma knows twice. Their happiness was hard-won. Ours is built in. This knack for finding light in darkness explains how they endured. It wasn't faith or stubbornness alone, it was the ability to look at a world designed to break them and still whistle a tune. That resilience echoes today. When we complain about Wi-Fi speeds, remember people who celebrated because the cabbage crop didn't fail. Of course, we see their world through a fog of myths and movies. Next comes the truth behind those polished Hollywood versions where the filth, pain, and sheer inconvenience of history get scrubbed away. Hollywood loves a good medieval fantasy shining armor, grand castles, fair maidens. Reality was less glamorous. Those grand castles. Drafty stone boxes where tapestries covered damp walls and the wind whistled through cracks. Noble. Ladies didn't flutter handkerchiefs they shivered in unheated chambers, picking fleas from their gowns. The romantic Middle Ages, you know, is mostly fiction, polished clean of lice, feces and suffering. Take castle life. Movies show nobles lounging in spotless halls. Reality. Rushes covered floors to soak up spills and stayed there for months. Dogs, servants. And rats tracked in filth. Smoke from poorly designed fireplaces stung eyes. Nobles slept in curtained beds not for privacy, but to avoid waking up with snow dusting their faces from gaps in masonry. That glass-stained window in films. Most castles had wooden shutters or parchment-covered openings. Even royalty lived in what we'd. Consider squalor. Life wasn't easier for nobles, just differently miserable. Yes, they ate meat daily, but it was salted into leathery slabs or swimming in grease. They drank wine, but it was often vinegar strong. A lord might own 20 gowns, but each weighed 15 pounds in layered wool, worn for weeks without washing. Noble children died just as often as peasants' medical care barely helped. One noble woman's diary lists 12 pregnancies and only 2 surviving children. Comfort was relative when childbirth and battle wounds could kill anyone. Hollywood's clean. Bustling villages are pure fantasy. Real medieval streets were obstacle courses of animal waste. Rotting food and human excrement. Towns banned butchering animals indoors because entrails dumped outdoors drew rats. People slept cheap to jowl with livestock. That cozy tavern from films. More like a hovel serving sour beer in grimy cups. Even market days reaped no icemen meat set. In the sun until sold or spoiled, the peasant homes shown in movies. Too big and tidy, most were single-room huts with mud floors. Smoke from the central fire escaped through a hole in the thatch, leaving walls blackened while everyone coughed. Beds were shared with children, grandparents, and fleas. Storage was non-existent. Harvests filled half the room until eaten. Privacy wasn't a concept when. Entire families dressed, undressed, and relieved themselves in one space. Film wardrobes are laughably wrong. Peasants didn't wear earth-toned linen tunics that somehow stayed clean. Will-dominated itchy, smelly, and stained brown from years of wear. Underwear was rare. Nobles didn't parade in jewel-toned silks, either fabrics faded quickly without modern dyes. That iconic princess gown. It weighed 20 pounds, required help to use the privy, and crawled with lice nobody mentioned. Medical inaccuracies are worst of all. No medieval surgeon had clean tools or gentle hands. Arrow wounds were treated by shoving onions in them. Surgeons set bones while patients bit leather. Straps. Childbirth meant a 20% chance the mother would die. Noble or peasant, a toothache could lead to a brutal extraction with dirty pliers. The idea of sterile bandages or pain relief was centuries away. Cinematic feasts mislead too. Spit-roasted meat. Rare except for nobles, and even then, often spoiled. Peasants ate pottage grain boiled into mush, seasoned with whatever greens weren't poisonous. Spices were worth more than gold. Sugar, practically mythical. A medieval peasant would faint at the sight of a grocery store's produce section. Even leisure was. Distorted, jousting tournaments weren't weekly spectacles but rare, invitation-only events. Peasants entertained themselves with drunken wrestling or betting on cockroach races. Music happened in fields, not banquet halls rough songs shouted over handmade instruments. Romance wasn't nightly love, but quick couplings in haylofts between shifts. The biggest myth. That anyone was free. Nobles feared losing land to war or royal whims. Peasants were bound too. Fields they didn't own. Women of all classes had fewer rights than farm animals. The church dictated birth, marriage, death. Modern prisons offer more autonomy than medieval freedom. Why does this matter? Because imagining nobles lounging in luxury or peasants merrily dancing minimizes their suffering. Real people endured cold, hunger, and fear we can't fathom. Their resilience built foundations we enjoy indoors: plumbing, antibiotics, the right to refuse your lord's third helping of mutton. Modern inconveniences pale next to medieval ones. Traffic jams beat dysentery. A dead phone battery beats a dead child from fever. When your Wi-Fi lags, remember your ancestors would have traded places before you finished cussing. Yet, even knowing the truth, we cling to myths, maybe because facing the full horror is too much, or because fairy tales need castles, not lice-infested stone boxes. But history isn't here to comfort us. It's here to remind us how far we've come and at what cost. The next time you see a medieval film, play spot the inaccuracies. No mud on hymns? Wrong. Minstrels playing lutes in taverns? Unlikely. A noble woman with clean hair? Fantasy. The real Middle Ages were darker, smellier, and more brutal than any director-dev show. Appreciate your washing machine, your ibuprofen, your right to refuse boiled cabbage for the 10th. Straight meal. These aren't small things, they're revolutions separating you from lives spent in unrelenting hardship. Hollywood's Middle Ages never existed. The real ones did, and thankfully. We don't live there anymore. But before we wrap up, think about this. Those people endured so we wouldn't have to. Their suffering built the world we take for granted. The least we can do is see them clearly not as fairy tale extras, but as resilient humans who survived against impossible odds. That's the real story, dirt and all. So next time you complain about slow Wi-Fi or cold coffee, remember, your worst day would have been a good day in the 1300s. Those people endured what we can barely imagine. No painkillers, no clean.